I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to speak to this bill and to confirm the Greens' support for this legislation, as we have supported a raft of gun control legislation over quite a number of years. And it's worth recalling in this context that this bill is evolutionary. The placing controls on military-style weapons actually dates relatively recently. Of course, the tragedy in Aramoana in 1990, where 13 people lost their lives, several others were wounded through the actions of a deranged individual who was in possession of a number of military-style weapons. And at that time, in 1990, the police had no knowledge of the existence or the ownership of those weapons, and there was no legislative framework or requirement that the police ought to know. And clearly that's an entirely unsatisfactory situation. We've moved on considerably from that point, and that's a good thing. More recent case law has been referred to, of course, 2009, I believe, where it was discovered a member of the public appealed against the classification of a weapon he owned as being a military-style weapon, and he won that case at the High Court. It highlighted the fact that there was a lack of clarity in the law, that the police position relying on the legislation was weakened by that, and so this amendment is intended to plug that gap, just to create some clarity around the legislation. And that's a useful and positive thing for Parliament to be doing. I must say I was very pleased, I was genuinely pleased yesterday in the Law and Order Select Committee when Police Commissioner Marshall, unprovoked, just of his own initiative, expressed his very, very strong belief that our police ought not to be routinely armed. He expressed a strong preference. He does not want to see our police routinely carrying weapons on their hip. And we are 100% in support of the Commissioner. Given that support, I think our responsibility in the House is to provide the strongest possible legislative framework to put good controls around weapons, around guns, so that the Commissioner's aspiration and our aspiration to not see our police routinely armed can be perpetuated, can be fulfilled. Guns, of course, have a legitimate use. They're routinely used by farmers to destroy injured animals. They're used for pest control, and of course there's a very large recreational lobby. I think the figure, it's something close now to 250,000 New Zealanders are licensed or hold gun licences, and that's as it should be. Given that and the prevalence of these, as I say, it's important we get the legislative framework right to enable legitimate use, but to put the strongest possible constraints on illegitimate or malicious use of these weapons. We think it appropriate that the air guns are captured in this legislation. They do bear resemblance to the military-style weapons. They could be used for malicious purposes, clearly, but even to protect anyone who is foolish enough to own such a thing and wave it about publicly would very quickly find themselves on the wrong end of an armed offenders call-out. Those call-outs always carry an element of risk, and obviously we want to avoid that wherever possible. Air guns also are quite powerful weapons in their own right in this day and age, and just getting sufficient control on those is an important thing to do. It's inevitable that there will be ongoing objections to the legislation. People will seek to find loopholes or legitimately believe that a situation arises where they are where their particular, as happened in the case of the gentleman, the Richard Lincoln, he found a legitimate claim against the legislation. That will continue, no doubt. So again, it's appropriate that this legislation does allow for recourse to a district court, to an appeal if any challenge to the legislation does arise. Further to that, I think I'd like to support the Labour, Mr Farfoy and William Sewell, in their appeal to the Minister to advance this idea of a reference group, of an advisory group. I wasn't on the Law and Order Committee at the time this bill went through the Select Committee process, but reading back, it's clear that there was a conversation about perhaps there ought to be a statutory body, and that the outcome of that decision-making was that that wasn't appropriate, but there's a strong call for some sort of an advisory group. And I think that's actually a very good idea. The police clearly have a lot of knowledge and in-house, if you like, expertise about weaponry. But I think people in the community who are legitimate gun owners and users also would be reassured if there is an open standing committee, some sort of a conduit between public, what I'll call the gun lobby, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but the gun lobby, interested parties around gun use. I think it would be helpful if there's a conduit in the form of something like an advisory group or a standing reference committee, so that those people could have a forum to have dialogue with police and other interested parties. I think that could help to avoid situations where there is a recourse to the courts, to legislation. We know taking an appeal or indeed going to the High Court is an expensive business, both for the claimant and for the police in the instance they were defending it. So I would encourage the Minister to look very hard at establishing some sort of a reference group, an advisory group that would enable interested parties to have that ongoing dialogue, and hopefully it would resolve any issues, give parties an opportunity to talk these things through without recourse to the courts necessarily. So, sir, I don't need to say any more than that. Again, simply to say we believe this is good legislation. We're happy to support it. Kia ora.
I call Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great pleasure to rise in support of the third reading of the Arms